For tonight's query journey, I asked the keeper of the time portal, what are the primary accounts and official reports surrounding the 1947 Roswell incident, and how have they evolved over time? Here's a partial reply to the query from the keeper from which our guest hosts for tonight's journey were chosen. Richard Dolan, Intelligent Disclosure. Jack Connor, Cosmic Road. Chris Lato, Files. Andy, That UFO Podcast. Jack Connor, Cosmic Road. Let's jump into it. What are the primary accounts and official reports surrounding the 1947 Roswell incident, and how have they evolved over time? Episode 2.
I know this myself. I went out to the debris field on one occasion. It is remote. It is not even now. It's not easy to drive out there. Had to be way, way tougher in 1947. They did apparently report back that they found an area that looked burned and that where the desert sand was glass-like. If that's true, that's very interesting, and it's indicative of very high heat doing something to the terrain. And in fact, I'll get into a little bit later, that was corroborated apparently by one other very important witness, a man named Dr. Lincoln La Paz. I'll get to him. Now, one thing Sheriff Wilcox did was to call the Army, the Roswell Army Airfield. This is very important now. This unit was home to a very, very important group. It was the 509th Bomb Group or Bombardier Group. This was the unit that was responsible for dropping the atomic bombs over Japan to end the Second World War. In 1947, the 509th was the only military unit in the world that had the ability to drop nuclear weapons. If you're looking for a group of soldiers entrusted with an elite task, you found them. They were commanded by Colonel William Blanchard. Blanchard later went on to become Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force and a 4-star general in the 1960s. So whatever happened here in Roswell clearly did not hurt his career. Blanchard sent a team to investigate what happened. This included Captain Jesse Marcel, intelligence officer, and he was accompanied by a counterintelligence officer named Sheridan Cavett and another Master Sergeant Intelligence Corps person named Master Sergeant William Rickett. These three visited Wilcox's office. They spoke with Brazel. They then accompanied Brazel back to the Foster Ranch, where they arrived late at night. Now, apparently, this was all confusing for years because Cavett denied it for years and years. But not only was he there, but so was Rickett at some point, who later gave details of this to researchers like Stanton Friedman and Mark Rodiger. But Cavett was really, he would not talk about this for years. It wasn't until 1994 when the U.S. Air Force did their own quick investigation of Roswell to get ahead of the congressional investigation. I'll get to all that. That Cavett spoke to an Air Force Colonel, Richard Weaver, and said, yeah, I was at the debris field too. Took a long time to get an admission out of this. Anyway, it was confusing to figure this out for a long time. Meanwhile, military police go to Wilcox's office. They collected the wreckage that Brazel had originally left there. So now we get to Monday, July 7th, 1947. This is a big day. So Cavett and Marcel had arrived the night before at the ranch, and they began Monday morning with and going over the debris field. Before I get to that, I just want to mention that this same day, July 7th, was the day that General Nathan Twining, who was head of Air Materiel Command and a 3-star general at the time, he later became a 4-star general, he flies to New Mexico. He goes to the Alamogordo Army Airfield, where he made the side trip to Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. So he's close by. He stays in the area for 4 days. And, the whole Twining connection is very interesting. And actually, that was covered in the TV show. They brought the Harding, who's the Twining character, basically, who's there. And it's been long debated, like, was Twining there for the Roswell crash, or was he there for something else? Now, it is true that Twining's trip to that area had been made as early as June in the calendar. This was a base, a bomb commander's course at Sandia Base in Albuquerque that happened from July 8th to July 11th. There were visitor logs, there's calendars that indicate that this group, along with Twining, took the course. But the thing is that Twining was also scheduled to take a trip to Boeing at this time, which he had to cancel. And then there was a letter a couple of weeks later in July to a Boeing executive where he refers to a, quote, very important and sudden matter that developed here that prevented him from going to Boeing. Now, what was that matter? Some people say it was the conference itself, which hadn't fully been cleared for Twining until July 3rd, so maybe that's what it was. But it's definitely true, I would say definitely likely, that the Roswell crash probably received his immediate attention. He's right there in the area. And one other thing I just want to mention about the Twining visit. So Twining is in the Roswell area at this time. There was another general named Carl Spaatz, who was commander of the Army Air Forces at the time. He was vacationing in the state of Washington at the time. Now you got to wonder how much of a vacation this would have been. New York Times actually wrote back then that there were a crew of P-51 Mustangs of the Oregon National Guard flying over the Cascade Mountains on an airborne alert. They were searching for the flying saucers that everyone was talking about. Spaatz was interviewed in the newspaper about this at the time. He says, I don't know anything about these saucers or any of the searches, the plans to search for them. Well, whether by coincidence or by design, you got two of the nation's most important Air Force generals just happening to be in the nation's two leading UFO hotspots. Let me go back to the Roswell debris field, though. So we're on July 7th, 1947. Many years later, Jesse Marcel told his story to UFO researcher Stanton Friedman. And what Marcel said is that Brazel took him and Cavett to the debris field, which was about 3/4 of a mile long and about 200 or 300 feet wide. There was a gouge in the ground, which he said was about 500 feet long. Okay, so just keep in mind when we get to the balloon explanation, if a balloon could cause this type of gouge and this type of debris, and I think the answer is clearly no. But anyway, what he noticed was debris as thin as newsprint, but which was incredibly strong. And now that's important and interesting itself. Later, another soldier told Marcel that the debris could not be dented, not even by a sledgehammer. There was also foil, which you could crumple and would return to its original shape without any wrinkles. That was interesting. Jesse Marcel also noticed I-beams with odd symbols on them. The beams could flex very slightly, but you couldn't break them. So all these years later, Marcel's telling Friedman, he said, this debris was definitely not a weather or tracking device. It wasn't any sort of plane or missile. And this is a direct quote from Jesse Marcel. It was something I had never seen before or since. It certainly wasn't anything built by us, he said. So that's Marcel. So that whole day, July 7th, Marcel and Cavett are collecting all the debris at Brazel's ranch. According to many accounts, Rickett, the third person in the group, came by with Cavett at some point. So those two fill Cavett's vehicle. Marcel says to Cavett, go on ahead. I'll meet you back at the Roswell base when I get back there. He fills his vehicle, and then late at night, this is Monday, July 7th, he starts his drive back to the base. On his way, he makes a stop at his house. At this point, it's 2 a.m. Wakes up his wife and his son, Jesse Jr., who's 11 years old, shows them the debris. He says this is part of a flying saucer. And of course, Jesse Marcel Jr. remembered that incident for the rest of his life and talked quite a lot about it. Marcel and Cavett we're at the morning, Tuesday, July 8th. They go to Roswell Army Airfield Base that morning. They got 2 carloads of debris. Colonel Blanchard, the base commander, notifies the 8th Air Force headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas. It's not that far from Roswell. And he says to Jesse Marcel, you're going to go there with this debris. You're going to meet with General Roger Ramey. So at this point, as far as we can tell, Marcel and Blanchard both believed that they had gotten pieces of these mysterious flying discs. At around noon that day, Blanchard says to his public information officer, Lieutenant Walter Hout, he says, I want you to give out a press release stating this fact. And Hout goes to a man named Frank Joyce at radio station KGFL. And they send it to Western Union, they send it to radio stations, they send it out to newspapers, reaches the Associated Press wire, 2:26 in the afternoon. And at that point, all hell breaks loose throughout Roswell. And I can assume all hell broke loose up the military chain of command. The Roswell Daily Record reported this story that evening. It was an evening paper. Carried 3 stories about the crash, all of them on the front page. Main statement, the intelligence office of the 509th Bombardment Group at Roswell Army Airfield announced at noon today that the field has come into possession of a flying saucer. Wow. Wow.
Wow. I think, well, I mean, I certainly know this is the first anyone has ever heard one of these AARO interviews, and thank you so much for letting us be the first to share this.
Okay, so it's interesting that the guy that Sean is working with says that they haven't asked the Air Force specifically about this information, but they have been trying to get information out of them before, and they haven't been able to get it. So it'll be really interesting to see if they do follow up on this, and if they do ask, the Air Force for these documents and this information about this incident. It'd be very interesting if so. If they can't find it, that would be really telling, because it's a big deal. I'm not going to read a long article about it, but I can read one little paragraph about the incident. Air Force Captain Robert Salas, that gentleman you just saw, right there, at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana in 1967, when 10 ICBMs he was overseeing suddenly became inoperative. At the same time, base security informed him of a mysterious red glowing object in the sky. So, if the Air Force can't find any documents or data pertaining to a UFO shutting off 10 nukes, you have to wonder what's going on there. Could they really not find it, or are they hiding it? Did they destroy it? Because they have a long history of doing all of the above, right? Or at least of destroying it or hiding it. I've been going back to Roswell, right? Here's the Roswell affair, and talking about all the disinformation that was put out. Yeah, and I believe this was a French intelligence report that was put out that studied Roswell. And here we go. At the very bottom, all of the base's administrative documents talking about Roswell for the March 1945 to December 1949 period were destroyed. So during that 4-year time span, the Roswell Air Force Base, all the records were destroyed, and all radio messages sent by the base from October 1946 to February 1949 were destroyed as well. The destruction report does not mention when, by whom, and on whose orders this destruction was carried out. Yeah. So, and this has happened over and over again. The Black Vault has FOIA stuff that has gone missing, right? And et cetera. This has been going on forever. That the UFO documents and data gets destroyed or misplaced. They can't find it. It's ridiculous that they expect us to believe any of that. And of course, the flip side of this is that AARO has not asked the Air Force for any of this documentation. So why hasn't AARO asked for this? Now, and you have a UFO shutting off 10 nukes. And, by the way, this is part of a series of incidents. This article goes through several different times where UFOs have interfered in a nuclear facility. Robert Jamieson, a retired USAF nuclear missile targeting officer, told of several occasions having to go out and restart missiles that had been deactivated after UFOs were sighted nearby. Several occasions. It was just kind of common for him to go out and have to restart nukes because UFOs had turned them off. And these are, people that had given testimony to AARO, these various witnesses in this article. And I'll link that to you, guys. But so I mean, this is something that happened repeatedly, that UFOs would interfere in nukes. So we need to ask the Air Force for this information, specifically for this stuff, because it looks like AARO wasn't asking specifically for this stuff. They were trying to get some U-2 spy footage, I guess, of UFOs, and they weren't able to get it. So if the Air Force can't deliver this and these other incidents, then clearly that's a pattern. They're hiding stuff, right? If it happens one time, maybe you could say it's an accident. Maybe. I mean, come on. 10 nukes being shut off. You're not going to keep those records. Come on. Really? Really? The other, the flip side is, can we really trust that AARO is going to sincerely endeavor to get to the bottom of it? I mean, we're talking, Sean Kirkpatrick here, right? Who has done nothing but lie and obfuscate since he became the director of AARO. Obviously his hearing / briefing before Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and Senator Ernst was a bunch of BS. He says, no evidence of ET. Sorry. Oh, and by the way, if we did find evidence, we wouldn't do anything with it. We would just give it to NASA. NASA, of course, has been hiding this stuff these many decades, scrubbing it out of videos, airbrushing it out of still pictures, etc. So, if it goes to NASA, it goes there to die.
The theory of the universe. That's what I really am interested in. That's kind of what, I'm very driven by that. But I think it does relate back. I think at least for me, just seeing the evidence for this and in my brain being like, oh, it's possible, it was like a little switch. It kind of opens up, possibilities. I think maybe we're just, until that switch is turned, it's impossible. There's just no way it could ever happen. So they don't make the jump.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if we'll, there's a lot of movement forward. I don't know if you want to segue into our next
let's do that.
But there's a lot of movement. It seems to be a lot of movement forward, but I think that, there's been disappointment in the past of, many times where, the government seems to be taking this seriously, starting, early on. 1947, we call the modern UFO era, basically after Roswell, which Roswell was kind of tucked away real quickly, but there was the Kenneth Arnold sighting in June ahead of that. And so that's where it begins. And there's a lot of confusion about Roswell. I don't know what happened at Roswell. I know that it was swept under the rug real quickly and forgotten about until the 1980s, until, people started talking about what happened.
Yeah, like Glenn Davis. I mean, that's an amazing interview. I watched that that's in the National Archives on YouTube.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So yeah, it's another bizarre thing. And I've always had the question when it comes to Roswell was, first of all, why would the Army Air Force, as it was called at that time, even say that they found a crashed disc and then retract it? I mean, why would they say it in the first place? They didn't have to say anything. It wasn't like, oh, everybody, we have to talk about this because it's going to get out or anything like that. No, they could have just said, we found a weather balloon. And it was nothing. They could have started out that way instead of actually having a headline that we have captured a disc. So there's a lot of moving parts to that. And, it's pretty well documented that the Air Force lied. I think it's four or six times. That's actually proven that they actually lied about Roswell. So it's a murky thing. It was brought back up in the 1990s. They did a supposed thorough investigation and once again lied. because
Yes.
one of the things were about the occupants at that point where people claimed to see occupants. And they said, well, that was the crash test dummies. And in 1947, I think it was 1952 is when they had the first crash test dummies. So, I mean, that was another proven lie. So I don't know what to think about Roswell. But anyway, moving forward, there was all these different organizations looking into the topic for the people, to protect the people, supposedly, or whatever, grunge, and then Project Sign and Project Blue Book, all these organizations. And basically, I think more or less window dressing a lot of it to kind of, calm the public down. And 1952 was a banner year for UFO sightings. Everyone was reporting them all over the country, and there was Washington, D.C., a major UFO, on radar, multiple days and things like that. So in 1953, there was a Robertson panel formed. And basically, what are we going to do with all these people calling in about UFOs? And we have to calm the public down. We have to explain it. We have to, and they came up with basically the ridicule factor at that point. The tinfoil hats, the little green men, and make people ridicule and get people talking about something else. So it's interesting how this has happened over the years and morphed and changed, and now we're in we're at it again where it looks really promising.
To see the sensors aren't as good. The water itself can be very restrictive in terms of measurements and all that, but that's something I'll be picking up with Richard, definitely. I don't want to go into loads of the cases in the book. We want folks to go and pick up a copy of the book itself, but do you mind talking us through what's one or two of your personal favorites in there?
Yeah, I mean, well, most people don't understand that there's a lot that happened before Roswell. So before 1947. So 1941, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, or the 1942 Battle of LA, and even some British cases, I think, that were before. And that, I think, in 1897 in Aurora, Texas. And then the 1933 event that David Grush talked about in his congressional testimony in
Magenta.
Italy. Yeah. So that, I think, is surprising to most people, that there's a lot of stuff that happened before Roswell. And then there's a steady trickle of cases, moving up into the early 2000s. And I think that's those are some of the most interesting aspects, besides the documents themselves and the relationships of the documents to various crash events. So that's intermixed in the book. It's copiously footnoted and referenced to a lot of other documents with indexes and appendices. It's a reference book, much like the first edition was, and so that's the real power of the book. I guess that's what there's 7 or 8 that are high cases.
Yeah.
Shag Harbor, Braxton County, Kecksburg, Roswell, Cape Girardeau, and it's not just me. I'm sort of assembling all these other researchers, great researchers, and their massive works. Many times people have written multiple books on a particular topic, and then you get the 10-page summary of what's going on. So it's really a compendium. If you take the approach that, oh my God, if just one of these things is real, then the whole world's different. And that was really it was the preponderance of the evidence that motivated me back in 2004, 2005 to write the first book. that it doesn't matter that some are fake. Maybe they are, but a few of them are real, and that's the oh my God moment.
Yeah, I think across the topic, I've tried to say that many times that people shouldn't be disheartened when they find out a case, an event, a story that they've been very keen on, or something they've really put a lot of eggs in that basket turns out to have been a lie, a fabrication, or do you know what? More evidence comes to light, for example, with Trinity, that you have to go, do you know what? We can chalk that one up to the solved basket. It's been identified. We know what it was. And you move on from it. It doesn't mean it ruins a subject for people and shouldn't do. I want to get to some listener questions, Ryan, before we run out of time.
Okay.
Thanks to everyone who sent stuff in. Aaron Fisher asks, is a flying disc the most common shape recovered? And what is the most credible recovery in your opinion? So 2 questions there.
Well, the most credible recovery is Roswell. I mean, there's multiple cases there. We get the most documentation, most research. And the most common shape is the typical saucer shape for events. But now there's been some great shapes, diamond shapes in the UK that were the Nick Pope saw on the UFO desk, and were documented in some newspapers.
That was the Calvin
Yeah,
photo that was,
right.
yeah.
And then I would say that the flying triangle is sort of the next most common in my mind, and the cigar shape probably next, and then spheres are everywhere. Little spheres, the big spheres. I don't see very big spheres very often, but the little spheres, and then finally the weirdest ones are the ice cream cone shape, where you have the typical ice cream cone with typical radioactive stuff. I think of the Cash Landrum case. The ice cream cone may in fact be ours, but that seems to be the most unusual shape.
And do you say ours because that's the one that has some sort of residue coming from it, and maybe there's something there, feeling something, and I can understand why.
Yeah, I mean, if you think, I don't think the ETs want to be spraying radioactive garbage across the galaxy. I mean, if they can tap the 0-point energy and the vacuum of space, or actually shield gravity, or manipulate gravity, or amplify gravity, and travel through the stars quickly, I mean, those things don't produce radioactive debris unless you need a lot of electricity or something to enable that. And then you need a power plant. So maybe you need a fusion power plant. And, there's the pedestrian fusion that's what's called neutronic fusion, or deuterium tritium, which creates radioactive waste, or there's and sort of the 45 companies in the world, 40 of them are working on neutronic or radiation producing fusion, and then the other handful, including mine, is antineutronic, where we're using proton lithium fusion, where you don't have any radioactive waste or residue, and you just make helium atoms and energy. So I suspect that if it's putting out radiation, it's probably ours.
This case, if that's not in Peru, correct me, but it was was that Brazil? That may have been Brazil. Anyway, I would Google it, but I don't want to disrupt the chat. But anyway, let's see. There's a lot of you guys are commenting. Well, thank you very much for commenting, guys. I'm trying to get to everybody, but there's so much. Have you seen the George Knapp tweet with Tom recently? Tom DeLong, and if that's true, that we're trying to defend against them, that sounds scary. Yeah, I think that was from 2019 or a couple years ago. Anyway, I don't know if that was a super recent interview, but that is making the rounds. And yeah, absolutely. That's interesting, right? That we are trying to defend against them. We are reverse engineering their technology and trying to defend against them. This is an interview because I'm with George Knapp, an interview by George Knapp with Tom DeLonge. And Tom has some great sources and some fascinating things that he has let drop over the years. And, he's interesting because, he's not the Dolores Cannon, Barbara Lamb. We're going into the fifth dimension. Everything is really good. The beings are here to help us. As he has a darker take on this. And that's, alarming because that's obviously coming from the information that he's getting from his sources. So, very alarming that he is getting that information. And he says we are reversing engineering the alien technology to learn how to defend against them. And that is something also that was said in the book The Day After Roswell by Colonel Philip J. Corso. That was the core thrust of that book. As in the opening, we are at war with the aliens, and I'll tell you how we got there. And then he goes through, takes us through reverse engineering the technology and how that has transformed our world, giving us, for example, the modern computer age, reverse engineering this technology from Roswell and presumably other crashes. But the idea was to reverse engineer this stuff to develop weapons to defend ourselves against them. And then at the end of the book, he talks very, very briefly about the fruits of that labor and how I think it was in the 70s that we were first able to shoot down a UFO. So using that reverse engineered technology. I don't know. There's various stories out there that say we shot down the craft at Roswell. I just came across a new one today. And, is that disinformation? I can't imagine that because it was like a pulse weapon that was said to have been used at Roswell in this version of the story. So, and if we've had ARV since the 60s, you would think that we would also have technology to, I don't know. I mean, there's so much conflicting information, guys. That's the problem with all this. The silos of information on this will get you. You can't go by one source, or even two or three connected sources like Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs. Great information. I don't discount any of what they learned, the whole hybrid thing and all that stuff. I think that is absolutely on point. But I think that Barbara Lamb and Dolores Cannon stuff is also probably on point as well. So what does that mean? Why are they getting such different information? And why are there so many different stories about Roswell? And the information I just came across today was another version of the whole two crashes at Roswell idea. But this had a different take on it, that we shot down both crashes, both ships. They didn't, because I just did a story on this the other day, that there's one idea that there were two objects that collided, and one of them became displaced in time and appeared like 10 years later. And in this other story, there were two objects as well, but one crashed. We shot it down with the pulse weapon. It crashed. Then a few days later, another object showed up to retrieve the bodies or help the survivors and also the technology to retrieve the technology. And we shot that down as well. I don't know, but it's interesting to contemplate that we may have had technology to shoot these things down since then, which means that Colonel Corso was wrong, or he didn't know that. That could have been a different group doing that. And I think there are different groups within the government and without doing different things. So anyway, UAP David says, catch y'all later. Thanks to you, UAP David, for joining us.
I would like to thank all of tonight's guest hosts as well. Until next time, never stop searching.